We will start again. We had some little technical difficulties. This is a little operation we have here. We're not a major network. Anyway, I'll start again. This is the Resistance Report, April 5th, 2017. The theme that I want to press upon tonight is taking responsibility, Donald Trump's failure to take responsibility. In fact, his whole administration failure to take responsibility, but the lack of responsibility starts in the Oval Office. And we hear it. The best and most recent case in point is Trump's response to that ghastly chemical attack in Syria that targeted civilians, including children. And what did Donald Trump say? Well, he immediately blamed Barack Obama. As if President Obama is still there. I mean, he's no longer president. Hello? He said, that is, Trump said, President Obama said in 2012 that he would establish a red line against the use of chemical weapons, and then did nothing. This was Trump's complaint, referring to Obama's first direct threat of force. And then you had White House Press Secretary Sean Spicer following that up, saying, these heinous actions by Bashar al-Assad regime are a consequence of the past administration's weakness and irresolution. Now, the blame Obama strategy used by the White House is doubly absurd because Trump was the one who kept saying that we should ignore Assad. In fact, he repeatedly advocated doing nothing with regard to Syria, insisting that Syria was not America's problem. This was his position during the campaign. This was his position for years. In fact, just days ago, on March 30th, his Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, said Assad's long-term status will be decided by the Syrian people, unquote. Well, that's, hello, that is code in diplomatic terms for the United States is not going to try to do anything. The Syrian people, well, the Syrian people are in a civil war right now. That civil war is being mounted by Assad, and there are a lot of other factions. Most of those people are not actually, are casualties of that war. So they're not going to be deciding Assad's fate. And on the same day, in New York, UN representative, that is Trump's appointed UN representative Nikki Haley, said, our priority is no longer to sit there and focus on getting Assad out. Well, hello? You can't have it both ways. You can't say the Obama administration failed to get Assad out, and then at the same time say, well, that's not our objective anyway. Do you see the problem of responsibility here? When nobody takes responsibility, nobody has responsibility. When nobody has responsibility, nobody knows who's in charge. And that's the problem, the fundamental problem with the Trump administration. At least John McCain puts responsibility where it belongs. He said today, Assad was encouraged, quote unquote, by Trump's hands-off attitude toward the regime. And he called it another disgraceful chapter in American history. Well, McCain is right. Now, this afternoon, Donald Trump seemed to change his tune a little bit. He said, the Syrian conflict is now my responsibility. But he shaved it a little bit. I couldn't believe when he said it's now my responsibility. But he said, if others had taken responsibility more before me, it wouldn't have been this problem. So, at least he says, at least for this afternoon, he says it's his responsibility. But you see, this is his whole foreign policy. At a news conference with Jordan's King Abdullah II yesterday afternoon, what did Trump say? He complained. He said, I inherited a mess. And he blamed his predecessor for, quote, one of the worst deals I've ever witnessed with Iran. Whether it's in the Middle East or North Korea, whether it's so many other things, whether it's in our country, horrible trade deals, I inherited a mess, he repeated. Well, let me just say, Mr. President, Mr. Trump, we are inheriting a mess that you are creating by not taking accountability and responsibility. Problems are piling up very, very quickly. You're pointing your finger everywhere but except yourself. You've got to stop blaming others. I mean, you did it with regard to the Yemen. Remember that failed Yemen counterterrorism raid? It didn't go according to plan. Well, what did you say? You blamed it on your generals and on Obama. And Trump blamed Obama for the non-existent wiretap of Trump Tower. That was blaming Obama for something that didn't even happen. And Trump blamed the failure of the GOP health care bill, not on himself, obviously not on himself. He blamed the Democrats. Hello, how could the Democrats be blamed for something where the Republicans have the majority in the House? And then he turned around and he blamed the Freedom Caucus, and he blamed the Heritage Foundation, and the Club for Growth, and he blamed everybody. Paul Ryan, barely. He even preemptively blamed that judge that stopped his Muslim ban. He blamed him preemptively for any future terrorist attacks. He even blamed the airport protests that accompanied that Muslim ban on a Delta Airlines system outage. You remember that? He blamed his own decision to remove National Security Advisor Michael Flynn on the intelligence community, the media, and the Democrats, he said, for trying to cover up Hillary Clinton's loss. He can't take responsibility for anything. He blamed the media for inventing a narrative that he criticized the intelligence community. He blamed the Senate Democrats for failing to confirm his nominees when his nominees were the most incompetent group of people you could ever imagine. Oh, it's the Democrats' fault for failing to get them all confirmed rapidly? Hello? Donald Trump blamed his loss on the popular vote on non-existent, fraudulent, 3 million to 5 million, he keeps saying, fraudulent votes. He blames Democrats for the long-running investigation into his contacts with Russia. He blames the intelligence community for leaking information about his contacts with Russia. Well, I could go on and on and on and on. You get my point. There is no responsibility here. No one is accountable. Harry Truman, a president who did not get enough credit for being responsible when he was president, he came up with a famous saying, the buck stops here. He was talking about the presidency. He was talking about his office. The buck stops here. I, the president, am responsible, said Harry Truman. On the principle that if a president is not responsible for what his administration does, who is? Speaking of responsibility or irresponsibility, Jared Kushner, the president's son-in-law, is now in Iraq after having arranged for the state visit of China's President Xi Jinping starting tomorrow at Mar-a-Lago. Well, why is Jared Kushner responsible for Middle East diplomacy and also responsible for China? Don't those seem like fairly large portfolios of responsibility? I mean, there is something called the State Department. And whatever happened to it? There's a national security staff. There are national security advisors. There are people who know a lot about the Middle East and also a lot about China. Where are they? Jared Kushner? I mean, what is this? Jared Kushner's portfolio, China and the Middle East, two of the most important areas in the world. It's either a cover-up for a Kushner-Trump organization business contacts. Maybe he's making some business contacts for Kushner and for Trump for the future. Or it's a means for Trump to dispose of basically issues he has no intention of dealing with. Or, and here's what I fear, it's a dangerous delusion that America's national security can be dealt with by a 36-year-old son-in-law with no experience in foreign policy or even in government. I don't mean to denigrate Jared Kushner. Maybe he's very intelligent, but nobody, I mean, even if he was 46-year-old or 56, Nobody can do it alone, even if you are a seasoned diplomat, even if you understand everything going on in the world. You can't do the Middle East, and you can't do China. Foreign dignitaries, by the way, take Kushner's role seriously precisely because it's familiar. In autocratic and authoritarian regimes, for the autocrat's children and members of the autocrat's family to replace state institutions. After all, China's Xi Jinping himself rose to power, partly because he was an important man's son. But whatever the reason for Jared Kushner having this much authority and responsibility, it is an insult to American diplomacy. It's an insult to America. It's an insult to the rest of the world. And it is dangerous. Talk about lack of responsibility. By the way, Trump reorganized his National Security Council today, removing from the National Security Principles Group Trump's chief strategist, Stephen Bannon. How do you read this? Well, here's how I read it. I have been in or around 4 presidents' White Houses, and I see a maneuver. When I see a maneuver, when something like this happens, you know it's because, in this case, Bannon was weakened because he did such a lousy job on the health care bill that Republicans had come up with to try to repeal and maybe replace a little bit of the Affordable Care Act. Bannon was in charge. He blew it. And that weakened him in the White House, which means that all of the people who are out to stab Bannon, you know, at Washington, a friend is somebody who stabs you in the front. Well, there's a lot of backstabbing and front stabbing in that chaotic cesspool of a White House, and they were just waiting for Bannon to be weakened, and the minute he got weak, you can imagine how quickly his enemies inside the White House moved to get him off of the National Security Council. But that means that nothing. That has no long-term meaning because there's nobody in charge in the White House. Reince Priebus? Forget it. Bannon will emerge again. The next issue he does better on, he will make sure that he's in the middle of the power. By the way, and finally, as long as we're talking about tonight's theme of personal responsibility, I cannot help myself but to point out Donald Trump's nice expression of support today for Bill O'Reilly, the Fox News host, over revelations that the Fox News star settled claims of sexual harassment and inappropriate behavior made against Bill O'Reilly for some $13 million. What did Trump say? He said, quote, "Personally, I think he shouldn't have settled," said Trump in an interview with the New York Times, "because you should have taken it all the way. I don't think Bill did anything wrong." Now, this from a man who once said of the women he groped, quote, "When you're a star, they let you do it." That was Donald Trump's famous line. This endorsement of Bill O'Reilly did nothing wrong. Well, what does nothing wrong mean to Donald Trump, particularly when you're talking about sexual harassment? Trump didn't think he did anything wrong either, after a video surfaced in which he said, "I did try and F-U-C-K her. She was married, and I moved on her very heavily. In fact, I took her out furniture shopping. She wanted to get some furniture. I said, I'll show you where they have some nice furniture. I moved on her like a bitch, but I couldn't get there, and she was married, and then all of a sudden I see her. She's now got these big phony," and I could go on, but you get my point. Donald Trump gives his vote of support to Bill O'Reilly and says Bill O'Reilly did nothing wrong. Well, I don't think Trump's support helped Bill O'Reilly's cause very much. And now, your questions. Casey Burns, will Bill O'Reilly take Bannon's place on the National Security Council? Casey, it's a good question. Somehow I doubt it, but you never know. Katie Hunter, first question. What's going on with Bannon getting booted? Well, I tried to address that. I think it's just temporary. Second question, why are the Republicans making an issue of Rice, Susan Rice? Wasn't she just doing her job? Yes, Katie, she was just doing her job. And let me just briefly explain it again. If you're National Security Advisor, you get a lot of reports from the National Security Agency and from the CIA and from the FBI. What you do is you determine what's going to be most helpful to the president to know. And the president every day gets a briefing. And the National Security Advisor makes a decision as to whether names of actual individuals need to be included unmasked as it goes to the president, or whether they can stay masked. And the National Security Advisor, when she was National Security Advisor, that's what she did. She decided that those names of Trump advisors, it was important that President Obama see them. And obviously it was important so he could make a decision as to what he was going to tell Donald Trump. And I imagine there was a meeting in which he told Donald Trump exactly what he had seen from the intelligence community. And I imagine Donald Trump knew exactly, when he became president, he knew all of this. In fact, chances are he knows much more. Nicole Tiller, why isn't there a branch of government that is not partisan that can put an end to Trump breaking all the rules? Do rules just not apply if you're president and the Congress is in your party? Nicole, I'm sorry to say that this seems to be the case right now. If you are president, particularly if you are Donald Trump and you don't think any rules apply to you anyway, you are entitled to break every rule that comes along, and that's what he has done in his entire life. And when he breaks rules and other people are unhappy about it, what happens? There's litigation, there are lawsuits. And his whole life has been filled, and his adult life has been filled with lawsuits. But now Donald Trump is in the Oval Office, and you've got Republicans who are in both chambers of Congress, the House and the Senate, and they are so far willing to play along. Again, with some minor exceptions. John McCain, Lindsey Graham, a few other Republicans, maybe, hopefully, there are going to be even more, as Donald Trump's approval ratings begin to sink big time with Republicans, then maybe some of those Republicans who are up for re-election, they're going to get cold feet. Right now, though, he can basically get away with anything. There is a place in government where there are neutral arbiters, however. It's called the federal court system. And you and I both know that those people are political appointees, but they don't, once they are in those positions as judges, they sometimes, in fact very often, understand their responsibility to the Constitution. And that's why there's pushback right now from the federal courts against Donald Trump. Lana Arthen, I'm seeing some talk about Senator Orrin Hatch being likely to end up president if and when the Russia scandal brings down Trump and Pence. And Ryan, what do you think? Well, Lana, there is an order of precedence, an order of succession. If the president is out of office, booted out of office, if the president somehow, and vice president, and even the Speaker of the House are tragically killed, then there is an order of succession on down. So it could be Orrin Hatch, but you've got to get pretty far down to get Orrin Hatch to be president. I don't mean that in any way as a criticism of Orrin Hatch. Deb Jones, is there any way the American people can vote on building a wall between the United States and Mexico? Shouldn't we have a voice? Well, Deb, shouldn't we have a voice in everything? The voice that we should have is supposed to be Congress and the president. They are working for us. Can I just make sure that you, Deb, and everybody else understand they are public servants. They work for us. If we don't like what they do, it is our duty and responsibility and obligation to get them out of there. That's why this 2018 midterm election is so important. That's why 2020 is so important. And it's also very important that you make your views known now. A congressional recess is coming up. Go to indivisibleguide.com. Indivisibleguide.com. Find out when your representatives and senators are going to be in town in their district and make a ruckus. Sabina Vaughn, can you explain block granting in simple terms and whether or not it is a productive allocation of federal funds? Sabina, the simplest way to understand this is the federal government just gives a chunk of money to the states and says to the states, you do what you want with it. That's the biggest form of block grant. Or it can be a particular issue, such as Medicaid. The federal government gives Medicaid funds to the states and says, you allocate it, you develop the criteria, you develop the allocation system, it's up to you. Now, normally, that kind of block grant is not terribly good for people who are African American or who are Latino or who are otherwise in the minority in the state, because if a state has any shard of racism or historic prejudice, the chances are that a state may shortchange the people who are supposed to get part of those block grants. Time for two more. Angela Carnes Sr., do you see a new, more inclusive party or movement forming in response to Trump and his administration? Angela, I wish I could say yes. I haven't seen it yet. Now, hopefully, Tom Perez and the Democratic National Committee will see that there is a gigantic opportunity right now because people are angry and frustrated, and across America, people are becoming activists as never before. I don't remember this much activism since the Vietnam War, the anti-Vietnam War movement. We've got people who are meeting in groups, in indivisible groups or other groups, and they are actively participating in politics, not just standing on the corner waving placards, but they're actually getting involved in the election, in their city, in their state politics. This is great. If there's a silver lining on this terribly dark cloud, this storm called Donald Trump, the silver lining is activism. Ian Garrison Keller, first time asking a question. What do you think I should do if I want to be an activist, but I don't have the means to go to protests? Well, Ian, as I've said before, protests are only one part of what you can or should do as an activist. In fact, if it's just protests, there's not going to be any change. The other part of what's necessary, and if you can't or get to a protest, that's perfectly fine. A lot of things you can do in terms of your telephone. You can call people. You can call your senators. You can call your members of Congress. You can call people who you know who are in the districts of swing senators, swing members of Congress, states, swing states, purple districts. You can find out how, through your friends who are living in these places, you can be of most assistance. And there are a lot of things you can do. I am one who, yes, I like demonstrations. I demonstrate. I like petitions. I join petitions. I do think that funding is important, and I and many of you are generous with regard to groups that are doing important things. But that's the beginning. That's not the end. You've got to be an activist in terms of using your time politically. And you can do a lot from your telephone. If you can't, if you are unfortunately unable to move very well, you can do a lot just from where you are right now. A lot of people say to me, well, I don't have the time. Well, you have the time to save American democracy. You have the time to make sure that we do not succumb to tyranny. You have the time for the benefit of yourself and your children and your grandchildren to make sure America is working for everyone and not just for a small minority of oligarchs and wealthy individuals at the top and Trump's friends. You make the time. And that's the end of tonight's Resistance Report. I'll see you tomorrow.